Welcome back, everyone. So for this class, we're going to be looking at two separate movements around the same time in the 1930s that go back to a more realist style, and specifically what's known as a socialist, social realist or socialist realist style. So we'll begin with the Mexican muralist movement, which had such a huge influence internationally, but especially on artists in the United States in the 40s and 50s. And in some sense, it actually paves the way for the cultural programming of the New Deal by FDR, which we're going to end up talking about, I think, next class when we talk about the New Deal and the way in which artists were a part of that. So we'll begin with that. It's an important movement, and then after our break, we'll go and look at a different movement. We'll check back in with the USSR, with the Soviet Union, and see what happens after all that incredible experimentation of the Russian avant-garde, like the constructivists and the productivists, who themselves have an influence on the Mexican mural movement, among other influences. So let's go straight away into the Mexican mural movement. So to understand this movement, we do have to do a little bit of history here, a little bit of pre-colonial, colonial, and post-colonial history in Central America, in Mexico. So, as with so many countries in Latin America, Southern America, and Central America, what we're dealing with, and not to mention this country, but what we're dealing with is a very long colonial history. That it's only in the course of the 18th and especially 19th century and early 20th century where you start to have a process of decolonization, where the European powers that had been in place for now centuries were finally sort of overthrown, and a new sovereign government could be put in place. So this is what's known as, the colonial period, and then a process of decolonization, and then once decolonization is over, you have what's come to be known as a post-colonial situation, what comes after colonial rule. The issue with so many countries that attain their sovereignty from these European colonial powers of the past, it's not like the next day everything is fine and dandy, and they really have full control. The people have full control, and we're now in a this wonderful sort of democratic society. And Mexico is a good case study of this, but this could stand in for Brazil, for Argentina, for Chile, for so many other countries in Latin America. So you have the Mexican Revolution, and then those that come into power once it becomes a post-colonial Mexico tended to be military and the business class, which in many cases will then continue their ties, especially economic ties, sometimes willingly, sometimes because they have to, there's no other way, with foreign powers, with international capital, and with these former colonialist countries. And so this is what happened in Mexico. So you have someone like Porfirio Diaz, and I have no Spanish, so for this lecture, please excuse me if I'm butchering names and butchering words. But he was president of Mexico in the latter part of the 19th century into the early 20th century. And he was beloved by the business community. He was beloved by the bourgeoisie and the military, who saw him as a good ruler. But he's a controversial figure in history because he was also something of a dictator. And among revolutionaries and the working class and the intelligentsia and artists, he was widely reviled. And during his reign, you did have artists that will be influential for the Mexican muralists that we talk about today, who were able to subtly critique this post-colonial situation that I'm describing for you. So one of them is Jose Guadalupe Posada, and this image is is so famous. I think I actually, this is like, I think I've seen this, like when I was in a restaurant and I saw like, you know, the bar and all the tequila and everything. I think actually there's a brand of tequila that uses his drawings as an advertisement. So a lot of people maybe have seen these without actually knowing that it's an artist, without actually knowing his name. But this is Jose Guadalupe Posada. And he did these caricatures, a little bit like Gross in some ways, like George Gross. He did these characters that would be in magazines, in broadsides, and posters, and that sort of thing. And this one was especially well known and famous. It was called the Calavera Catrina, which roughly translates to the dandy or like dapper skeleton. So what you're seeing is a skeleton. The gender would be coded as female, a woman skeleton, likely because of the hat and the feathers and the ribbons, that sort of thing. But it's also called La Calavera Garbancera, or Gabancera, which means that this was a well-known name for anyone who tried to make themselves, anyone who was Mexican, who was ethnically indigenous, tried to pass themselves off as more European. So in the way they would dress, they would take on more European style. In the way they put on makeup, they would try to lighten their skin. So by using the skeleton, which inherently, usually, you know, skeletons are very white. The bones have a white quality. Posada is poking fun at this. And so this type of art, which is it's popular, it's populist, it's a caricature, but it's realist because it's highly identifiable, and it's political. It's definitely social political. It's making fun of this elite class that has basically, in the minds of Posada and so many others, they've become the colonizers, but from within, by taking on the infrastructure and everything that's been left behind, especially with the military and the economy. So this is a pattern that recurs over and over in Latin America, though it's also one that recurs over and over in the history of colonization, decolonization, and post-colonization in Africa. Right. So this is a big history that we're doing here. I'm giving you tools to understand the history, the political histories and struggles that have to do with the legacies of global colonization by and large European superpowers that go back 400 years. So in 1910 to 1920 you have a revolutionary war headed by, these are probably the two most important figures of the revolutionaries, Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, which gives his name to the Zapatistas. That happened in the 90s when they, in 1994, where they announced themselves. And well, I'm not going to go down that current history, but it's very much in the legacy of the Mexican Revolution that happens from 1910 to 1920, and they overthrow Diaz. And this is very, very important. So you have artists and poets and intellectuals and writers who back the revolution. And then once the revolution is over, we have and Diaz has been overthrown, we have a new political situation. One that in some ways is similar to the success of the October Revolution in 1917 from 3 years before, like halfway across the world, or a fourth of the way across the world. We now have a moment where the new power structure is actually favorable to communist ideas, is actually favorable to culture and to art. How this pans out will be slightly different from the Russian avant-gardes that we've talked about. But nonetheless, there are some similarities. So you have a reformist that comes into power after the revolution, President Obregon, and even more importantly is the Minister of Education, who in some ways he's not an artist, but because he pushes for the development and the founding of this mural movement, In some cases, he's called the father of the Mexican mural movement, Jose Vasconcelos. And so he supported all sorts of public forms of art. This is incredible. I think we just have to stop and think about this, that we have a new ruling class, a new set of politicians that are friendly to art and culture and thinking, that are friendly to all these things, which normally are seen to be either frivolous, like politicians who cares about art, or dangerous, right? Artists and poets and philosophers, like these people they all have these ideas that could trouble the status quo. So we have to stop a moment and think like how incredible it is that you have a moment where the political situation is favorable to creativity and is favorable to the idea of society and art actually working in tandem. And this is exactly what Vasconcelos had in mind. He thought that visual culture, art, but not just art, could inform society and allow people to be part of this new country that they're founding, this post-revolutionary country. And to do so, his idea, which is taken up by the Mexican muralists, is it's actually a complex set of ideas. But one of the central ideas is that he wants to go back to pre-Columbian, that is pre-colonial traditions, which he thinks binds everyone together, not only the bourgeoisie, but also the working class and indigenous people and so on and so forth, right? That everyone has a share in this pre-Hispanic, pre-Columbian, pre-colonial tradition. So a lot of the artists that we look at, and we look at the big three, Orozco, Siqueiros, and Rivera, they're they call them the Tres Grandes, the three big Mexican muralists. They will also, as part of their practice, will look to traditional movements. So this is sometimes called heritage primitivism. So this is different from primitivism as we've talked about in other sections of this class. This is not primitivism as in like going somewhere else and trying to find like something old to then use in your art. This is going back and trying to tap into a tradition that's imminent to the movement itself. These would be, Mexican, indigenous ideas that come back to found this new art. But it wasn't just that. They look to the past heritage, but they also look to other styles. So definitely some of the European avant-gardes that we've studied in this class will be influential on some of these artists. We'll talk about that when we look at examples. And also Italian Renaissance art, which is so well known for these monumental murals. Diego Rivera, probably the most well-known of the Mexican muralists, was sent by the government, by Vasconcelos, to Italy to study Italian Renaissance painting and murals. And so we can, this is just Art 101, but we can go back and look at Raphael's philosophy, the School of Athens, which is at the Vatican in the Signatory Room. And so, this is a large monumental mural with all these figures from antiquity, all these Greek thinkers, with Aristotle and Plato at the center. Monumental mural painting with this. It really is an incredible organization of ideas and of figures of people. Without knowing who all these other people are, you do get the sense of this incredible organization of a massive mural painting. It really works. It works really beautifully. I've actually seen this in person. It's a wonderful mural painting. So that will influence, especially someone like Rivera, but the other muralist as well, and then also more traditional, indigenous and traditionally Mexican forms of visual culture will also be influential. So this is an artist that's that's working under the Diaz dictatorship, and then during the revolution. And so you have these really beautiful, these peasants, farmers with flowers on a boat going down the river. It's a really ennobling, really beautiful image of just everyday life, of normal everyday working peasant agrarian people. And so this would also be a very important visual aspect and influence on the Mexican muralists. So you have, as with so many movements, you will have manifestos. And here's just a couple manifestos from our Mexican muralists that we study today that just give us an extra sense of what the thrust was behind the Mexican muralist movement. This one's from 1921. It says, to create a monumental and heroic art, a human and public art, with the direct and living example of our great masters and extraordinary cultures of pre-Hispanic America. So this is exactly what I've been describing to you. Right? It should be very, very, very clear. And here's another one from 1924, a declaration of social, political, and aesthetic principles. And just the fact that you have a movement that couples the social, the political, and the aesthetic together tells you a lot about the ambition of this movement. In this manifesto, it says, we repudiate so-called easel painting because it's aristocratic, and we praise monumental art in all its forms because it's public property. This is very, very important, this first sentence. And your critical antennas should be raised here, because you're going to start to think, oh, this sounds a lot like the Russian avant-garde. This sounds a lot like what the constructivists were saying. And yes, there's quite an influence of the Russian constructivists here. The constructivists were also against easel painting. Easel painting simply means like an artist having a canvas on an easel and they paint something, right? This is a very traditional understanding of painting. And here it's deemed, as the Russian constructivists deemed it, to be aristocratic and also too individualistic. Like, here is the painter with his painting. He or she pours out her genius onto the canvas, and then it gets sold or goes into a museum, and it's then all about the artist, right? It's very liberal. It's very much based on the individual. And it's also seemingly only going through private channels, or prioritizing private property and private possession. But so they don't want anything to do with that. For the Mexican muralists, this goes back to colonial and then post-colonial periods, where those in power were just acting like European aristocrats and loved all things European. They wanted a form of art that would be more monumental and more public and in common, collective. These artists are, in many instances, directly aligned with the Communist Party. They are very much of the left. And they believe in collectivity and communal responsibility and communal ownership. So there is definitely something about public murals, not unlike graffiti, where it's in public spaces and it's there for everyone to see and to be edified by and to be able to interpret and to be able to enjoy, right? So for the mural as a medium, be it in a public building or in a public space outside, it's inherently more populist and collective, right? And so this is why on the next line it says, art must no longer be the expression of individual satisfaction, but should aim to become a fighting, educative art for all. So no more conceptions of art as the artist, as the solo genius who is, like a gift to mankind. But now art should be this communal thing that's much more didactic, pedagogic, which means educational, and part of this new revolutionary public sphere. So that's the conceptual thrust of all these works, and the sort of the foundational ideas and figures of the Mexican mural movement. So now let's look at the big three. The first we talk about is Jose Clemente Orozco. And this he did in a school in Mexico City, and it's called The Trench. And so you can tell it's this monumental mural painting. It is realist. The figures are naturalistic, and he's conveying a narrative. Though Orozco usually is talked about in distinction from the other two that we're about to look at. He's more universalizing. His paintings have more to do with almost like a universal conception of humanity, even though he's showing you Mexican revolutionary figures here. But his is more of how do I put it? Like a slightly more open view of muralism and of this moment. You get slightly less specificity and historical references, as you will see in Siqueiros and definitely Rivera. Here, these Mexican revolutionaries who are clearly suffering and in pain in this edifying war scene, they could almost stand in for other similar struggles in other parts of the world. So there's something slightly universal in the sense of his works. And maybe that's not a coincidence. Orozco was probably the least, he was of course committed to the revolution, and he was committed to ideas of solidarity, but he was the one that was a bit skeptical about the Communist Party. He was a bit skeptical about some of the ways that the revolution was unfolding. And so his images seem to be less direct, and slightly more poetic, and at least universalizing. This is probably the best way to describe his paintings. As far as influences, yes, of course, there's an influence of older traditions, of pre-Columbian traditions. Often the colors that Orozco uses seems to reference back to the colors of pre-Columbian pottery, these earthy tones. So that's one way to make certain connections. But he's also looking to the European avant-garde here. While this is a realist work, there are ways in which the figures and the landscape and the space they find themselves in, there's something angular and slightly expressionist about the bodies and the landscape. So often there are influences of expressionist movements from the avant-gardes, especially the German expressionists who we've studied. The other thing to say about this work, which is interesting, is that it's often read as almost like a crucifixion scene, where you have the like this cross-like composition, so going up this way and then going across this way. And this figure especially looks like he's in some ways in a position of being crucified. But what's interesting about this crucifixion scene, if it is one, it's coupling. It's not the crucifixion of one person. It's three figures, sort of in this sort of crucified solidarity. And this is reinforced by Orozco by the fact that the figure in the center, his leg is almost flush and parallel with the legs of this soldier. Their feet are meeting, so this creates like a moment of conjunction here, and his arm is going underneath and more or less disappears underneath this revolutionary. And then this one, he has his legs bent, and it's almost seamlessly becoming part of the body of this revolutionary who's crouched over. And in a really interesting detail, he almost like seems to be tied, anchored, fusing with the rock, with the land itself. So these three figures represent a crucifixion that's not of an individual, but more of three, of a set of soldiers. And so this might be read symbolically as a form of martyrdom for Mexico, for the revolution. Well, whatever the case may be, it's this really ennobling. Even though it's a scene of martyrdom, it's not bloody. It's not really violent in any obvious way. It's this sort of universal ennobling of the moment. So that's Orozco, and he would have a huge influence. Maybe of the three, he probably has the biggest influence on subsequent artists. Rivera is as big of influence as is Siqueiros, but Orozco has a really large influence. The second one we talk about, the second muralist, is Siqueiros, David Alfaro Siqueiros. And whereas Orozco maybe is slightly more general and universalizing and possibly a bit ambivalent about the revolution, about communism, Siqueiros is the most politically direct and also active. Like, he's an artist, he's a painter, but he was also an activist. He worked with unions. He set up a collective called the Syndicate. He was by and large the most politically committed and part of the communist party. And so this is a very large portrait of the bourgeoisie that's in Mexico City, and you can tell his conception of the bourgeoisie and the history of the bourgeoisie is a very violent, very destabilizing one. It's often said that Siqueiros is, of course, influenced by Mexican tradition, but he was also looking to the European avant-gardes, and especially something like surrealism. There is something slightly surreal about the image here, and especially in its warped, very strange sense of space, which is a little dreamlike. Though I think here we would probably say nightmarish. Like, it's more like a nightmare. So the portrait of the bourgeoisie, the bourgeois class, who would be all about capital and power, and then also complicity with the military class, with military power. That's all over the place here, right? So you have this strange machine with sort of blood running through it, and coins being sucked into it or sucked down, and then being transmogrified into blood. This is very clearly like a type of blood money sort of symbolism. You have these rather scary shock troops with gas masks that we saw in Neusachlichkeit up in the front, and then just legions of military walking throughout this urban space, a very technological, very dystopian urban space. You don't get the respite and the beauty of like the landscape and of nature in here. This is the bourgeoisie, the city, and militarism just completely oppressing you as a viewer. One day, one of my dreams is to go to Mexico and Mexico City. I've never been, and Mexico City, I've heard, is unbelievable. And there are all sorts of really wonderful artists, contemporary artists that live there today and make work. So one day I'd love to see this in person, to see how it really does work on you as a viewer. It's monumental. This is not part of the painting. This is just railing, right? So imagine yourself, you're probably standing here, you're dwarfed by this heroically scaled mural painting. Then in the center you have this bird crossed with like a bomber, like some kind of jet that's screaming across the sky here, and then you have this neoclassical or classical building here that's up in flames, and it says Liberté, Égalité, Fraternité, which is the calling card of the French Revolution of 1789, from which all subsequent socialist and communist revolutions will evoke back to the idea of the people having liberty, of everybody being equal, and fraternity means like goodwill and everybody like joining together in solidarity. These are the ideas that would be incredibly important for Marx, for Engels, and for Lenin, and for all of these, and for Mao, all these figures in the history of leftist struggle in world history, in recent world history. So all in all, Siqueiros is giving you a very dire view of the bourgeoisie, one in the world where one in which the world becomes this unlivable hellscape, right? Very, very clear. The last one we talk about, and again, historically now, the most important and well known, not least of which because he was the rather unfaithful husband of, not to judge, but the rather unfaithful husband of Frida Kahlo, who Frida Kahlo, I would say, probably now has become more beloved and probably even more famous than Diego Rivera. But in any case, here's Diego Rivera, and this is his history of Mexico from the conquest to the future at the National Palace in Mexico City. Another thing that would be wonderful to see in person. So this one, unlike the previous ones, I really don't have I don't have figures in there. I don't have like actual human beings standing in front of it to give you the scale. But here I do. This is only one part of this mural in this National Palace. So here these two ladies are kind of like leaning back on this banister or this railing of the staircase, looking up at the mural. So you're getting a good sense of the scale. And this is typical Diego Rivera style. So whereas Orozco is more universalizing and Siqueiros is more like, at least in the version at the example we just looked at, more claustrophobically surrealist and realist at the same time, Diego Rivera is much more literal, and you have a lot of references to history, like direct references, either in certain figures and certain symbols, or in certain locations, right? So here, and also more obvious, at least in these examples, more obvious references back to pre-Columbian traditions. So he's providing a whole history of Mexico, from pre-colonial to colonial to post-colonial to revolutionary Mexico, and so you're slowly meant to kind of travel up the history of Mexico, and then of course you end up with at the very top you end up with Marx, who's leading who's leading everyone towards this utopian communist future in Mexico. So this tells you a lot about Diego Rivera's politics. He is adamantly anti-fascist. So you see again here these Nazi shock troops in the middle here, and he is anti-bourgeoisie. He's anti-capitalist class. Here you have, it'll be more obvious in the next example I give you, but here you have like a bourgeois class, the titans of industry and capitalists who are hobnobbing and decadent, being shown in unfavorable light. And then he's absolutely pro-communist, pro-Russian Revolution, as you can see here, the communist worker with the hammer and sickle, referencing the October Revolution. And then, of course, you have these Mexican revolutionaries who are standing with Marx, going off towards this utopian Mexico that's both agrarian and technological. So you see this very clearly in the next work I show you, which is by far his most well-known work, largely because it actually doesn't even exist anymore, largely because of the controversy that surrounds it. So through the success of the Mexican mural movement, they started to through the success of the Mexican mural movement, they started to gain notoriety and attention of art collectors and even museums in the United States. So the MoMA, it's well known, the MoMA, the first monographic exhibition, which means the first exhibition of just one artist, was Matisse. But then you may not know this, the second monographic exhibition was of Rivera. So this tells you how prominent Mexican mural painting was in this country. And Orozco, Siqueiros, and Diego Rivera were commissioned to do murals throughout the United States, on the West Coast and on the East Coast. There's a well-known set of murals by Orozco in the New School right here in our city. So once everything opens up and it's safe to go back out, if you're walking by the New School, pop in at some point I think you can just go in. Well, these days you probably need an ID or something, so maybe not. But that would definitely go against the idea of collective public mural work. But Orozco has murals in the New School, among other places. Diego Rivera was asked to do some in Detroit, and then most famously was asked to do a mural at Rockefeller Center, again in our fair city. And here he is. You see him with a drawing, with the study of the work that he proposes. This is it. This is a photograph of... so this is a study, and then I just jumped the gun here. But this is a photograph of the unfinished mural called Man at the Crossroads. That was unfinished in the RCA building. This was taken by Lucien Bloch just before the work was stopped in May 1933. And so you might ask yourself, why would Rivera, who's well known, who's already had a show at MoMA, who's acclaimed, why would his work be censored after having been invited? Well, this is because we have an uneasy marriage of ideologies here, one that's certainly not easily resolved. You basically have the richest oil family, and Rockefeller was, I think, at that point, the wealthiest person in the world. This titan of industry, this arch capitalist, right, who certainly would not want anything to do with communism, because of course this would be a threat to the level of accumulation of wealth that his life represents. He wouldn't want anything to do with that. So he and actually his son invites Rivera, because of course Rivera is well known and they like his art, but they were uneasy about his politics. Rivera was not an arch capitalist. He was part of the Communist Party. He was a leftist. And so from the get-go, there was an uneasy ideological marriage here. And so it was fine. It was going fine. This is one of the key themes of art of the 20th century, is that there are forms of transgressive art that they seem transgressive, but those in power, and especially capitalism, is able to sort of just eat it up and subsume it and sort of tame it. So that, I think that was the hope here. But while everything was going fine, the moment that Rivera includes this guy, and you may know who this is already, that's Lenin. The moment he introduces Lenin, then it's a firestorm. That's something that can't fly in the United States circa 1933, especially under the commission of an arch capitalist like Rockefeller. And so it becomes news, and there's a big firestorm, media storm. And Nelson Rockefeller, the son of Rockefeller at this point, he writes Diego Rivera a letter, which I love because this is like corporate speak. It's like it's a veiled kind of speaking, and it's fawning, but also it's fawning, but also making a directive at the same time. So he says, viewing the progress of your thrilling mural, I noticed that in the most recent portion of the painting you included a portrait of Lenin. This piece is beautifully painted, but it seems to me that his portrait appearing in this mural might very easily offend a great many people. As much as I did like to do so, I'm afraid we must ask you to substitute the face of some man where Lenin's head now appears. So you see, it's lovely. I find it very funny the way he both sort of fawns over the painting and Rivera, and then pretends to kind of ask to cover up Lenin, but he's not really asking. Let's be honest, right? He's the one holding the purse strings. So it creates this real controversy, and the assistants of Diego Rivera were already uneasy that they're being commissioned by someone like Rockefeller, which goes against their ideological leanings. They sort of, along with Rivera, decided, no way, like we've already gone so far as to paint a mural for you. We're not gonna then start censoring our mural. So Rivera says, I'm not gonna take Lenin out, but maybe I will, to appease you, This is to Rockefeller. Maybe I'll add a few like more American people in here, like American heroes and that sort of thing. That doesn't fly. So basically what happens is the mural is covered up, and then at some point it just gets totally destroyed. So this is the only documentation we have of the original mural, right? But fear not, he went down to Mexico and completed a different but very similar version of Man at the Crossroads, and I'll show it to you in a second. So originally this is what he submitted as the mural, an early sketch, which there's a lot of similarities, but notice there's no Lenin. So this is maybe like a way to get in. There's no obvious communist politics in the sketch that he submitted, as there is in the last one. So this is it. This is what it would have looked like if it wasn't censored. Man, Controller of the Universe. So the title has changed a little bit. This is called Man at the Crossroads. And then the one that he ultimately completed a year later is Man, Controller of the Universe, which is, again, in Mexico City. Again, like, this is one of the reasons why visiting Mexico City would be amazing, to see all these massive murals. So it's a really complex composition because there's so much going on. Remember, we looked at that Raphael and the School of Athens, this incredible organization of bodies. Rivera has definitely learned how to organize all these bodies into one cohesive composition. And so while it's complex because there are so many components, the organization, the composition is in some ways quite clear. You have Man, Controller of the Universe here. So he's standing in for all of humanity. By man, today we would say, humans, to include everybody. So here he is with like a joystick, and then there's this other large hand coming out holding this orb with technology and like readings in it, and then this pipe going down into the ground. All of this is part of this large structure, right? So there's this incredible faith in technology that Rivera has in the center. On the right of this Controller of the Universe, you have the good side for Rivera, the good side of humanity, the future, or what the future should be according to him. On the left, you have the bad side of humanity, what he deems to be things that are bad for the future of humanity. So let's just very briefly look at both sides. Let's start with the left side. So we're gonna be here for a second. So once more, these really scary shock troops with their bayonets, they're all lined up in a row, sort of oppressively holding presiding court over the rest of the scene. Then you have Zeus with, it's very strange, though it's not as strange once I explain it to you, with a crucifix. So this is not like a Christianization of Zeus. This is basically just Rivera giving you a symbol, an icon of religion itself. So religion is something, remember Marx says that religion is the opiate for the masses. Religion is just something that keeps people afraid and in check and numb and stupid and that sort of thing, right? That's the prototypical Marxist understanding of religion. So religion is on the bad side, along with the military. Then you have, this is funny, you have Darwin here. You may know what Darwin looks like. This is Darwin and like X-ray technology and these strange apparatus here. And you basically have this I don't know how you want to read it, but like a evolutionary regression here. He's pointing to you to this parrot, and then you have a monkey who then is turning into or touching the hand of a human baby. And then you have a dog, a lamb, a turtle, and a cat, and a snake, and so on and so forth. So here he's making reference to the theory of evolution of Darwin. What he means by this, it's a little ambiguous, it's a little debatable, but I like to read it as a comment on social Darwinism. So he's not really against like the scientific theory of evolution, though he may well have been. He was probably like a humanist who thought that humans were special and apart from the rest of the animal kingdom. But there is a way in which this could be read as a critique of social Darwinism, which was quite current in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Social Darwinism is very simply social Darwinist thinkers basically think that politics, society is the survival of the fittest. It's only normal and natural that those that have wealth and power have that because they're stronger than those who don't have it, right? This is a rather stupid misreading of Darwin's evolutionary theory, because in Darwin, those that have adapted, those that do well and then pass on their genes and then move forward in the process of evolution, it was totally by chance. It had nothing to do. It just so happens that this finch has a bigger beak, and that works well for the ecology of the place in which that finch lives, and then they're going to do better than finches that don't have that kind of beak. It's totally a coincidence. Evolution runs on pure chance. So a social Darwinist will then have to say that, well, it's just pure chance that some people are poor and some people are rich, which is a crazy argument, because of course that's not true. There are social and power and political structures in place that make certain people born into poverty and others to be born into wealth. It's not at all a natural process. It's one that's conditioned by social structures. So this might very well be more of a critique of social Darwinism than, let's say, the theory of evolution itself. Then you have workers, and notice, well, this resonates with us today, as it has for a long time. You have people of all different races, normal everyday working people who are protesting and being beaten down by the police, some on horses. So you see the batons. And they're kept outside of this little bubble here. And today we would say this is like, the upper class, the 1% kind of thing. People playing cards, dressed really nicely, having drinks, and so on and so forth. Excuse me. And there's a really wonderful detail here where one of these guys, and I think it's this guy, the guy with the monocle, this actually is Rockefeller himself. So after the debacle of a year before, Rivera put Roosevelt on the bad side. I'm sorry, Rockefeller, not Roosevelt, Rockefeller on the bad side of the mural. And directly underneath this is like a microscope, so it's showing you bacteria and viruses and so on and so forth. Evidently, his head is right next to syphilis or gonorrhea, this venereal disease. So really a scathing send-up of Rockefeller after the debacle of last year. So this is all the bad side of humanity. As you might guess, the good side of humanity are the leftists and the communists. So this time, no big deal. Lenin is in there, again, with people of all different backgrounds and ethnicities and races. You have Russian and you have Russian revolutionaries up here. You have the head of religion cut off now. Remember Zeus on the other side with the crucifix. The religion has been decapitated, as has fascism. So fascism comes from the term that's a bundle of sticks, where the sticks together you can't really break them, and then you have the symbol of the Nazi party here, the swastika. This represents fascism. That too has been decapitated by this red uprising, with all these healthy, wonderful dancers, these soldiers on guns. Here's the head of the statue that's been decapitated, and then real historical figures. Here is Trotsky, here is Marx, and I think this is Engels. So along with Lenin, he's actually put specific political thinkers that he was amenable to, and that most of the Mexican muralists were totally amenable to. Okay, so that's it for Mexican muralism. We'll take a break, and then we'll head off to another moment of movement of social realism, but it'll be it'll end up in the end will be different for those artists. But we'll get to that in a second.